Hello everybody, welcome back. Time for another book review. I would actually just like to say thank you to everyone who noticed in the last vlog that I had my hair cut. I had 7 inches taken off my hair a couple of weeks ago and I feel like a new woman. But unfortunately I didn't remember to keep, because you can sell hair for quite a lot of money, can't you? Anyway, so thank you very much for noticing. However, as you can still see, it's still winter in the UK, so you've got a very plain background as I search desperately for natural light. Anyway, books. The book that I want to talk about today is In the Days of Rain by Rebecca Stott. Now, I picked this book up as I was wandering through Waterstones just before Christmas last year, and I picked it up because it's on a subject matter that actually particularly fascinates me. It is the subject of religious cults. Rebecca Stott is a Brit, and she was born into a fundamentalist Christian sect called the Exclusive Brethren, and she was there for a large portion of her life. Her dad was very high up in the Exclusive Brethren in the UK, and it was a very zealous family and a very zealous cult. However, her family left the cult in very contentious, divisive circumstances about 20 years before. And Rebecca Stott, who is herself a novelist, was with her father as her father lay dying in his old age. And her father had always wanted to talk about the Exclusive Brethren, the corruption, his time there, his memories, but couldn't quite ever finish his memoirs. And so as he became iller, Rebecca worked with him, interviewed him, spoke to him to collate as much as she can to try and help him finish the book. But she always found that her father got to a point and then he stopped, that there was too much guilt, too much shame there, and she couldn't ever really dig any further. So she kept coming to dead ends. After her father died, Rebecca committed herself to finding out the full story of not just her time in the Exclusive Brethren, but indeed the operation of the Brethren itself. How can so many smart, brilliant people end up being fooled by such an obviously controversial and exploitative cult? And it is that is the real brilliance of Rebecca's writing. And this is an excellent book because it weaves in not just psychological examination of how it is that good people can be convinced by corrupt people to believe something that isn't true, but also it brings in the personal touch in that Rebecca talks about her own family's experience and indeed her father's, and how lost he had become during this time. In the Days of Rain, so it pretty much starts up a great piece of history actually. It talks about Scotland in the 1800s. Rebecca spends some time briefly there because she wants to explain how people can go searching for answers in non-institutionalized religion. So in the 1800s, the mid-1800s, there was what was known as the clearances in Scotland, where the peasants and workers were forced off the land by the Scottish nobles who wanted to take the land and the profits for themselves. This obviously pushed a lot of the Scottish workers out towards the ports, out towards the sea, very bitter and angry. They went looking for support and community, and they weren't necessarily going to look for institutions that the landowners had themselves validated, such as the Catholic Church, nor were they particularly interested in the corrupt churches that had taken great swathes of tithes and taxes during all their time they worked the land. So they went looking for new religions, new groups, new communities. This is very much how the Brethren started. The Brethren started as a very pious Christian group and was very much based on the Scottish workers at the time, and obviously it then was part of a worldwide group. And so this went on. The very fundamentalist point of the Brethren was that they believed and believe that Satan rules the world, that basically that the human race is sinful and unclean, and that in order to meet God's demands and to be welcome at the second coming and to go up to heaven, we have to be pure. What happened is, over the years and over the centuries, that pursuit of purity became extreme and corrupt. So the Exclusive Brethren became obsessed with removal from the wider world. It would demand that members started moving away, living separately from members of their family who weren't part of the Exclusive Brethren. They started saying that you couldn't eat with people who weren't part of the Exclusive Brethren because the sharing of food was a very, linked to Jesus and the sharing of food. You couldn't therefore share food associated with people who weren't part of the exclusive brethren. And this, of course, started splitting up families and friends and making the community more inward looking. It also then started getting further and further, where a bit like Scientologists, they started developing the concept of audits, that people would be investigated to make sure that they remained pure, that their thoughts were pure, that their souls were pure. And so, of course, these things start permeating themselves, and over time they start becoming a system of fear and a system of terror. What's particularly interesting in Rebecca's story is she then talked about the 1960s, so when her father was a younger man and how he became swept up. So of course in the era of the 1960s, everything is all sort of free love, radicalism, rock and roll, rage against the oldies, and it's sort of with the baby boomers, the new generation coming through. There was a guy in the Exclusive Brethren in the States called JT Jr. And as a younger man, he really rode this wave to the top of the Exclusive Brethren. He commandeered, corralled all the younger men. And of course, it's men that were only allowed to really speak up in the Brethren. Women were to be household wives, and that was it. So he corralled and commandeered all the men to really reject and overthrow the older men who were ruining and ruling the Brethren. And this sort of appealed to the zeitgeist at the time. It was hugely successful. And JT, this rather obscure guy, overthrew the existing order of the Exclusive Brethren and took control for himself. And that's when the terror really became tight and deeply institutionalized in the Exclusive Brethren. So these audits became supported with violence, and it became supported with fear and terror that really corroded families. There were increases in suicide rates, and there were, as families became cleaved. So now not only could you not eat with people who weren't Exclusive Brethren, you couldn't have them in your lives, you weren't to share any part of the day. You weren't now, JT introduced a diktat that you couldn't even work with people who weren't Exclusive Brethren. So doctors, lawyers, teachers, anyone who worked in any kind of practice lost their jobs because, of course, they couldn't work. And so it suddenly became very corrupt. This is where Rebecca starts unpicking at her father's own guilt and shame, because it turns out her father was very heavily involved in this part of it, particularly the violence. And it was that shame that really destroyed her father, because she then talks about the years her father and her mother and her family spent in the sect, and really the breaking point for them and the impact it had on them afterwards, because even though they managed to leave the Exclusive Brethren, they obviously lost all their friends, and all the members of the family ended up in very tumultuous emotional situations, particularly her father, who became very reckless and hard to predict, and obviously wrapped up in a lot of guilt and shame, and how that affected her relationship with him. There's a lot of spiel there. This book is excellent. It weaves in the micro and the macro beautifully. There are moments where it's quite funny, there are moments where it's quite scary, but Rebecca, as this interested narrator, it's a narrator which is involved and has an emotional attachment and into the story, makes this really interesting. It's therefore not dry, it's fascinating, and you can really see the human element of it. And a nice touch is Rebecca is now a mother herself, and even though she has spent a lot of time out of the sect, it's interesting for her how she says she still, because it was so influential in the formative years of her life in terms of thought and language, how even today she still has to double check herself when her daughters chat about something, or where she's out in the street or shops and somebody says something, and she has to she's still there with her programming trying to override it. But cults remain a very interesting subject matter for a lot of people at the moment, and wider than that, I also found this book really interesting and informative on how people can be led to believe bad things, and that isn't just about religion, that obviously can be extended to politics and to wider things generally. So it has a beautiful psychological edge, but it's also very emotional and beautifully written. It's a sizable book, but I flew through it. It's really beautifully written and very emotional, and it has very bittersweet ending. I enjoyed it immensely. In the Days of Rain, Rebecca Stott.